system in the country. There's often a huge disparity between if I walk into a medical provider and say I need rotator cuff surgery, if my group health plan is paying for it, it's one price. If workers' compensation is paying for it, it's another price, and the price under work comp is substantially higher. Labor and management representatives from the Workers' Compensation Advisory Council agreed that we should do something about this and recommended that the legislature adopt a fee schedule for some of these common workers' compensation procedures. That legislation did not pass this session, which was a disappointment from our standpoint. So we'll take another run at it again this upcoming session. And then industrial sand mining reforms. The huge industry growing in western Wisconsin, where we have some of the roundest, coarsest sand in the country, the kind that's perfect for hydraulic fracturing, and so we want to see some streamlining done there, so that, for example, if you are a sand mine with an environmental footprint, you get your air permits, your water permits, and so forth from the Wisconsin DNR as you normally would, and don't have to get parallel permits from a county or a city or a village or a town. We think that there's going to be additional tax reform, or at least we hope there will be in the next session. High capacity well permitting reform. This is a really big deal to our agricultural sector. We've got, through a series of court cases, we've got a lot of uncertainty surrounding the permits that you need for the types of wells that farmers need for irrigation and that municipalities need for drinking water. And then transportation funding. We've seen a growing shortfall in our transportation fund that goes back to a number of prior budgets ago where funding was taken from the transportation fund to pay for other priorities like schools and other state spending. But it's really being squeezed right now because we rely primarily on the gas tax, and with more fuel efficient vehicles these days, although we're traveling as many or more miles in cars every year, we're using less gas to do it, which means we're generating less gas tax. So I think the legislature is going to have to come to terms with the fact that if we want to fund our transportation priorities in this state and have the kind of infrastructure that I think we all agree is needed in order to conduct commerce in Wisconsin, we're going to have to find a more stable source of revenue for the transportation fund. Any questions on those items before I get into the voting record? Yes, Ann? 5 minutes? Okay. So very quickly, at the end of every legislative session, I'm going to go back because there's a quote. This is the front page of our legislative scorecard, and it might be a little bit hard to read, especially for the folks in the back. But there's a quote on there that says, "You can't be pro-jobs and anti-business at the same time. You can't love employment and hate employers." And that was a quote from Senator Paul Tsongas in 1992 when he gave his speech at the Democratic National Convention. And we think that although it's been many years since those words were spoken, we think they ring true today. That if you want to be pro-job and you can't be anti-employer, and you can't claim to be pro-business unless you vote pro-business. From our standpoint, it's that simple. So we put together our scorecard at the 2013-2014 session. We scored votes both for Assembly bills and Senate bills, and it was 21 in the Senate and 30 in the Assembly that we scored. We give our Working for Wisconsin award to any legislator who scores 80% or better on our scorecard. This session, that ended up being 17 members of the state Senate and 59 members of the state Assembly. In terms of some of the bills that we scored that we think are significant for businesses and our mission of making Wisconsin more competitive, we had the fast forward training grants, of course the state budget and the tax cuts that were in there. There was a venture capital fund created, the minimum wage bill, iron mining, the phosphorus reform that I talked about, the $100 million property tax relief bill that was passed as a special session bill last November, and then the $35 million in additional training grants, kind of building on top of the original fast forward legislation that were also done in the special session earlier this year. What that ends up looking like is, it's really, I just took every legislator who represents at least a portion of Dane County, and you end up with legislators sort of all over the map. But we think, it's important, as we said, to let people know, to let businesses know, and to let our members know how their legislators are voting on the bills that our members and our board of directors tell us are key for businesses. 2014 elections, I probably, Ann, don't have a whole lot of time to go through this. I'll say this, that I think the two races at the top of the ticket, the gubernatorial race and the attorney general's race, I think both of them are going to be very close. It's a midterm election, and so voter turnout is typically less than what it is in a presidential election, which means that it's often an issue of the Democratic Party trying to turn out their base voters in large numbers, and the Republican Party trying to turn out their base voters in large numbers. And so often in midterm elections, the winner is which party does a better job of turning out their base, and so that will remain to be seen. The public polling that we've seen definitely shows a tight race for both the governor and attorney general. It's a little bit different for the state house races, like the Senate seats and the Assembly seats. Wisconsin typically doesn't have huge coattails, and perhaps that's for a variety of reasons, but just kind of thinking of the balance of power, right now the Republicans have an 18-15 majority in the state Senate, and there's a couple of key retirements. Senator Dale Schultz, a Republican, retired from the 17th district in southwestern Wisconsin, and Senator Mike Ellis retired in the 19th district up in the Neenah, Menasha, Appleton area. And so those two open seats, I think, will be significant in terms of what the balance of power in the Senate looks like afterwards. I think because it's a midterm election, that probably favors the Republicans a little bit, because if you just look at the voting history of those two districts, Republicans tend to do better in those areas in midterm elections. If I'm making a prediction on what the Senate looks like in 2015, in January of 2015, when the new legislature is sworn in, I think that the Republicans will probably have 18 or 19 seats. The state assembly is a little bit different. Republicans currently have a 60-39 majority, and there's a decent number of seats in western Wisconsin that are pretty much swing seats, and there are seats that kind of flip back and forth between Republican and Democratic representation, and seats where in a presidential year, President Obama, for example, does pretty well in these seats, even though a Republican might represent it in the state assembly. So, but I think when you look at some of the marginal seats that Republicans are going to need to defend in western and northwestern Wisconsin, and there's a couple of opportunities, I think, for Republicans to pick up a couple of seats from some that are currently represented by vulnerable Democratic assembly people. I think you could see Republicans losing a net 2 seats or gaining a net 2 seats or somewhere in between. I think that they're at 60 right now, and I think it's probably plus or minus 2 seats is probably where that is going to go. Now, I've been wrong before, and you know, making political predictions is always fraught with peril. But when you look at kind of the political environment right now and where it's at, and I think that the Republicans keep the majority in the Assembly, and it's probably somewhere between a 62 to 58 seat majority for them. Any questions at all on the elections or budget issues or anything? Yes.
We hear politicians both locally and nationwide talking about job creation. Is it the politicians that create the job or the business people we have here in the room?
Well, some politicians are business people, but you know, we don't believe that the legislature creates jobs. We believe that the legislature can create an environment that's conducive to job creation, and that gets back to, you know, competitiveness. And there are a lot of factors that define whether or not a state is competitive or not, and a lot of them relate to tax structure and litigation climate and, you know, cost of energy and availability of a skilled workforce and the level of education of the workforce. There's so many of those that I think the legislature can impact either directly or indirectly, but no, I don't think the legislature creates jobs. Businesses and entrepreneurs create jobs.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, thank you for the opportunity to.
Thanks, Scott. Will you be available for a few minutes if anybody has questions?
You bet.
Just before you leave? Okay. Thanks so much for coming out today. It's a gorgeous day, so maybe you have the afternoon off to go. And I just have 2 announcements. On September 23rd, we have our member mixer at Park Bank. So that's always fun, good networking opportunity. That's from 4:30 to 6 p.m. And then next month's luncheon is October 16th. And we will feature a speaker from the Clean Lakes Alliance, and that will be held at the Water Tower Chop House. So we hope to see you again really soon. And we have all sorts of events coming up, as Terry mentioned, and thanks again, Scott. Thanks for looking on this.
Thank you. Yeah.